Shalom, this is Chris. We're following Jesus along the Talmudim way. Deuteronomy chapter 11. This is the final chapter in Moses' opening sermon that will lead us next time into a deep dive into the law. Father, we ask you to bless our study and have us be like the Bereans who receive the word with all eagerness, but who examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. And by this teaching, enable each of us to be doers of your word and not hearers only. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Deuteronomy 11, verse 1, You shall therefore love the Lord your God and always keep his directive, his statutes, his ordinances, and his commandments. Moses is concluding really the last chapter. This is probably where chapter 10 should have ended. The true test of faith is not an intellectual statement or even a passionate display of worship, however sincere it may be. The true test of faith is a transformed life of obedience from a heart that desires to be obedient, and that's what we learned in the last chapter. This, again, is Moses' impassioned plea for the next generation to be obedient, and it's almost as if he knows they're not going to be for the most part. From verses 2 through 7 in chapter 11, Moses is again going to stress Israel's history and how it should form their theology. Then there'll be a definite change in pattern between 7 and 8. From verses 8 through 20, Moses will talk about the land that they are inheriting. Things are going to go well for them as long as they recognize that God is the one who is providing them. This is really, again, the final challenge before presenting what is known as the law, starting in chapter 12. And the choice is going to be obedience versus disobedience. They have free will. They can choose to disobey, and by the way, so do we. Our choice is really the same as what Moses is presenting that next generation of Israelites. Now, Moses is going to repeat the Egypt story, which we've already read in chapter 4 and in other places. And although it's repeated, let's not gloss over that repetition. It's there for a reason. And I think the reason is God knows that we're prone to very quickly forget his works and his greatness as soon as we hit a dry patch or a rough patch. So Deuteronomy 11, verses 2 through 4. Know this day I'm not speaking with your sons who have not known and who have not seen the discipline of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, his outstretched arm, and his signs and works which he did in the midst of Egypt to Pharaoh the king of Egypt, to all his land, and what he did to Egypt's army, to its horses, chariots, when he made the water of the Red Sea engulf them while they were pursuing you, and the Lord completely eliminated them. Discipline here means education. It's just like discipleship. It's not punishment for sins. Moses could really say, consider the education that you've received from the Lord. And again, most of the current generation had not witnessed the Exodus, or they were too young to have had firsthand memories, at least. Now he's going to get into what this generation did see. What he did to you in the wilderness until you came to this place. What he did to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, the son of Reuben, when the earth opened up his mouth and swallowed them, their households, their tents, and every living thing that followed them among all Israel. But your own eyes have seen all the great work that your Lord did. So here he's going to list their 4 specific recollections. The first couple were in the previous generation, and now these last few, most of the current generation were all adults, and they would have witnessed. So what he did to the Pharaoh and what he did to the army of Egypt, God lists that as a separate action from all of the other signs and wonders in Egypt. The deliverance from Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea are 2 separate events, and maybe we should read that as salvation and baptism are 2 different events. One doesn't save you, one is a response to already being saved. And then in this passage here, what he did in the wilderness, this one's curious. Moses doesn't actually say what God is referring to here. In chapter 8, Moses talked about provision, that they had enough to eat and enough to wear throughout the 40 years. Just as a father who cares for his son and like a shepherd watches over his flock, so God carried all Israel in the desert. That could be what he was referring to. And then the last one here is Dathan and Abiram. This is a recollection from Numbers 16, 13 through 14, and it's an event known as Korah's rebellion. Numbers 16, 13, it is not enough that you have brought us up, this is their complaining, out of a land flowing with milk and honey. So they think Egypt is the land flowing with milk and honey. God's going to set them straight. To have us die in the wilderness, would you also appoint yourself as master over us? So they're grumbling against Moses' leadership here. Indeed, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor have you given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Would you gouge out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. So this is a rebellion. God was none too pleased with their pessimistic appraisal of the situation. They were not patient enough. Then what happened next is the earth actually opened up and they were taken out of the equation very rapidly here. Moses is perhaps reminding his audience that idle words and grumbling, particularly those spoken against God's chosen leaders are quite toxic, and we really need to watch our tongue here. Such grumbling, of course, is on display during the age of the kings, as most of the kings rejected the prophets, Amos, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. They all struggled with being accepted. And of course, Jesus too was also rejected. So this is kind of a warning here. Don't lift your hand against the Lord's anointed. If God picks someone, then you follow, or you be quiet or get out of the way, whatever the saying is there. Grumbling and just gossip are very toxic. Now, this natural break between verses 7 and 8. The land as a gift is verses 8 through 12. The land is a test. In verses 13 through 21, the land is promise, 22 through 25, and then the land is opportunity through 26 through 28. Remember, the Israelites have a choice whether to accept or reject God with respect to the land. And we have those same choices with respect to the kingdom, which is not limited to blessings from the land, but also includes spiritual blessings. So put yourself in this equation here of the promises that God gives and know that they are available to us as well. Verse 8, you shall therefore keep every commandment which I am commanding you today, so that you may be strong and go in and take possession of the land which you are about to cross to possess it. And so you may prolong your days in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them to them and their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. Remember the therefore rule. Whenever you see therefore in the Bible, you need to ask, what's it there for? Here, Moses underlines the fact that God's request for Israel's obedience rests on what he's already done for them. Because he's already done great things, because he's already made the promises, then obedience is required. And then if you get that, then blessings will follow. The land is given by covenant. It's not any ordinary land. We'll talk more about that covenant as we work through the chapter. Verse 10, from the land into which you are entering to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you came. So very much a contrast from the Korah's rebellion, where they said, you brought us out of the land of milk and honey. Not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you used to sow your seed by water and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden. But the land into which you are about to cross to possess, a land of hills and valleys, drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord are continually on it, from the beginning even to the end of the year. So there's something very special about this land. Moses is moving here from a history teacher to a geography teacher, and he's going to contrast the land of Egypt versus the land of promise. Remember, they have not seen the land of promise other than Joshua and Caleb. So this is all new to them, and they are, they're having to take it on faith that where God is leading them is actually a good place, and that's the same for us. In Bible typology, Egypt represents the world and the world system. This is even true with agriculture, because in Egypt, nothing grows apart from human involvement. Everything is man-made, and yes, it's true the Nile routinely overflows and waters the land, but mankind has to dig trenches, and you can see this in this picture. When it says the reference to water it by your foot, that's likely talking about this trench system, where one would allow or block water coming in to water the fields by taking your heel and then moving the dirt around. This is a picture from a class that Cindy Parker gave on chapter 11 here, and she's demonstrating it during her lecture on Deuteronomy. So it's a screenshot of a video of showing this on a slide projector. So sorry, the quality is not great. But since the land is extremely flat, particularly in the Delta region where the Israelites live, this was easy to do. John Thompson, who's a commentator, states, the continuous expenditure of human effort tends to create the impression that the high productivity of the land was due entirely to human industry. Now that's Egypt. That's the world system. That's the mindset that they have. In contrast, Canaan is a land where God is much more directly involved. As verse 9 said, it's a land promised by covenant. In contrast to Egypt, which really grows nothing by itself, mankind has to work and cultivate and do all that. Canaan naturally flows with milk and honey. In contrast to Egypt and the flat delta with its stagnant waters, Canaan has hills and valleys that conjure up images of flowing streams with fresh water coming down from the hills and watering the landscape. In contrast to Egypt, which requires human effort to water those crops, in Canaan, we're told the land drinks the water from heaven. And when it does that, the land produces seemingly spontaneously. So the trees grow and produce fruit without any human intervention other than you've got to pick the fruit. In other words, God cares for this land and his eyes are continually upon it. Don't miss here the Garden of Eden type description of paradise that we have here. Now, certainly it's not that, and there's no land is perfect because human sin is imperfect, but God says if you are obedient, this land can be like an Eden, and that's the image of the kingdom that we have. The kingdom is like an Eden if we are obedient enough to inherit it. And it shall come about that if you listen obediently to my commands, which I am commanding you today, to love the Lord your God, and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul, that he will provide rain for your land in its season, the early and late rain, so that you may gather your grain, your new wine, and your oil. He will also provide grass in your field for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. So verses 13 through 21 are talking about the land as a test. Moses presents here the land as a choice with significant consequences: the blessing of prosperity and life resulting from obedience, or the way of adversity and death resulting from disobedience, just like the Garden of Eden, where Mr. and Mrs. Man had a choice to make and they made the wrong one. The question here is, do you really fear the Lord? This early and late rain is getting back to the agricultural calendar that we talked about earlier in our study. James mentioned it here. Be patient, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until he gets the early and the late rains. The early rains in that time, they didn't start their calendar with January. That's really an odd time in winter to do that. The early rains began at the first part of the year, which is in October. The late rains then ended in March and April. And what would happen, the long, hot, dry summer, you'd have these early rains that begin to soften up the land so they can start to work it. And then you have heavier rains in the winter, and then you've got soft rains again in March and April to help them plant their crops for the upcoming season. So verses 13 through 15 in Deuteronomy 11 describe the passing grade. Now let's look at what happens with the failing grade. Beware that your hearts are not easily deceived, and that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them. Otherwise, the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you. He will shut up the sky so that there will be no rain. The ground will not yield its produce, and you will quickly perish from the good land the Lord is giving you. We saw this back in chapter 8. The question is, would their prosperity cause them to give thanks to God, or would they give thanks to other fertility gods, the small g gods? If they do the latter, then God's going to turn off the spigot of rain, and the land will suffer, and of course, by consequence, they will not have any produce to survive with. In verse 16, the word deceived can also mean seduced in Hebrew. It's curious how God often phrases people turning away from him in terms of marital and even sexual infidelity. We see that in Hosea 2, 7 through 10. She will pursue her lovers, but she will not reach them. And he's talking about his people here, his people being unfaithful to him. She will seek them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my first husband because it was better for me than for now. So they're going to turn back to the Lord. Yet she does not know that it was I myself who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal, meaning they gave credit to Baal. Therefore I will take back my grain at harvest time, and my new wine in its season. I will also take my wool and my flax that I gave to cover her nakedness. So now I will uncover her lewdness before the eyes of her lovers, and no one will rescue her from my hand. You shall therefore take these words of mine to heart and to soul. You shall tie them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets on your forehead. You shall also teach them to your sons, speaking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your sons may be increased on the land, which the Lord your God swore to your fathers to give to them, as long as the heavens are above the earth. Of course, this is very much like the Shema we read in Deuteronomy 6. There's some slight differences, but generally it's the same. Now, what's interesting is that God is tying obedience back to the Shema in chapter 11, and he's saying the passing grade for the land blessing is by doing these things. So don't miss that. This, as long as the heavens are above the earth, is interesting here. It sounds like a bit of a contradiction because at one time he says, I've given you the promises to Abraham. They're unconditional, but yet at the same time, it seems like they can break the covenant, which means they're conditional. So which is it? Block suggests here, and this is interesting, that both can be true. The covenant is eternal. God's not going to break his covenant, but the access to blessings of covenant for any individual on any generation is conditional. And so there's two sides to the same coin. And we actually see this in the New Testament as well. Those who would say that Israel broke God's covenant and now the promises of God now fall upon the church because they rejected their Messiah, they're entirely incorrect, because Paul says in Romans 11:29, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Yet at the same time, it's true that every generation of the Israelites and every individual Israelite had to affirm his or her acceptance of the covenants by faith, and they had to demonstrate fidelity to the Lord. So it is with us. If we look at Matthew 7:22, many will say to me, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Leave me, you who practice lawlessness. So it is all about faith, and it's not about the things that we do and just outward appearances. We've got to know him and have faith in him. Yes, our salvation is eternal and secure. Yes, it is a free gift from God. We did nothing to deserve it. Yet it is our choices by faith that we affirm our acceptance or rejection of that salvation. And we demonstrate fidelity to the Lord that way. And if this sounds like a paradox, perhaps it is. But I think you can see both working through Scripture here. Our salvation is free and unearned, but we can also reject it if we practice lawlessness. And on this note, the opposite of law is not grace. The opposite of law is those who do lawless deeds. Verses 22 through 25 speak of the land as promise. Moses here is going to begin with another call to covenant in chapter 20, in verse 22, and then he'll reiterate the rewards of covenant faithfulness in 23 through 25. For if you are careful to keep all of this commandment, which I'm commanding you to do, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways and cling to him, then the Lord will dispossess all these nations from you, and you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. Every place on which the sole of your foot steps shall be yours. Your border will be from the wilderness to Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, as far as the western sea. No one will be able to stand against you. The Lord your God will instill the dread of you and the fear of you in all of the land in which you set foot, just as he has spoken to you. Much of this we've heard before. Each generation must choose the way of life and blessing or the way of death and cursing. Joshua's going to reiterate this gift here in Joshua 1:3. Every place which the sole of your footsteps, I have given it to you, just as I spoke to Moses. This is Joshua quoting God. Moses gives the broad definition of the promised land, as opposed to, we'll get to the end of Joshua, and we'll see that they didn't actually take that. They just took the narrower definition, really from the Jordan westward and not from the Euphrates, which probably in this context refers to the beginning of the Euphrates in what is modern Turkey and Syria, not the end of the Euphrates. That's all the way to Iraq. Verse 26, see, I am placing before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, which I am commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way which I'm commanding you today by following other gods in which you have not known. This is the first time blessing and curse appear in Deuteronomy, but they will be stressed again at the end of the book. And it's almost as if Moses is going to press the pause button between chapters 12 through 26, and then he's going to pick up this train of thought again in 27. There are really no articles that probably should be translated. I place before you today blessing and curse. This is like an altar call from Moses. Remember, this is all given as if it's a sermon, because it's our choice too. Our difficult is the consequences of disobedience is not always immediate, and this leads us to thinking we are getting away with it. Sometimes the sin is so apparent and kind of gets uncovered that one's entire life comes crashing down. We've seen that with some mega church pastors recently, but many more of us, we get comfortable with our Baals and our Ashtoreths that we worship alongside of Jesus, and just kind of live that way and nothing bad happens. And so we're comfortable with the free gift of salvation, but we don't realize our actions may be signifying that we're not really accepting the full gift, and we're actually choosing the way of cursing without knowing it. Neutrality is definitely not an option. Each of us has to make a choice. And it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which you are entering to possess, that you shall place the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. Are they not across the Jordan, west of the road towards the sunset, in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arabah opposite Gilgal, beside the oaks of Moreh? Now, they had not been there, so this is all new to them, but they've heard the stories about Abraham and Jacob and others, and Joseph, which we'll look at on a future slide. For you are about to cross the Jordan to go in to take possession of the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and you shall possess it and live in it, and you shall be careful to do all of the statutes and judgments which I am placing before you today. So again, despite no one ever seeing the promised land other than Joshua and Caleb, Moses is giving again a geography lesson here, pointing out two of the taller mountains that are nestled around the town of Shechem. So Mount Ebal to the north is 3,077 feet in elevation. Gerizim to the south is 2,849. They don't have, other than Hermon, they don't have huge peaks there like our Pacific Northwest or the Rockies or anything like that. So potentially these may have been visible from where Moses was standing. We aren't sure. If not, they probably pointed them out as they were making their way along the east side of the Jordan River on the banks there. These mountains represent the heart of the promised land, almost literally, because if one were to draw a straight line from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, these mountains are actually the midpoint of that line. So the blue line points north to Dan, the red line points south to Beersheba, and the idiom from Dan to Beersheba is it's like saying the entire land. And so it's curious that Shechem is right in the middle of the nation. These two mountains, you can see on the picture there, along with the town of Shechem, carry a very significant place in Israel's history, and they've always represented the place of choice. Abraham chose to worship God here, but almost everyone else made a wrong choice, and it's been a place of disaster. Genesis 12, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem and the Oak of Moreh. So they'd heard these stories, and so when Moses referenced the Oak of Moreh, they probably went, just like Abraham. Now the Canaanites were in the land at the time. This is the first town mentioned in the Promised Land was Shechem, and it lands right between these two mountains. Shechem, however, was a snare for Jacob. In chapter 34, we have the Dinah story, where his name becomes a stench because they slaughter the men of Shechem. And then in chapter 35, verse 4, they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which they had, and the rings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was near Shechem. So was Jacob supposed to hide them, or was he supposed to destroy them? It's almost like he's hiding them so they can come back to them at some future time. Joshua is later going to complete the challenge that Moses set before the Israelites at in Deuteronomy 11, and he does that in Joshua 24. Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel right here at Shechem and called for the elders of Israel, their heads, their judges, and their officers. They presented themselves before the Lord. Then skipping down to verse 24, the people said to Joshua, "We will serve the Lord and obey his voice." So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and are a statute and ordinance in Shechem. And this is where he read the blessings from Gerizim and the cursings from Mount Ebal. Gerizim later becomes the home of the Samaritan temple, referenced in John chapter 4. This photograph shows the relationship between Jacob's well, which you can see on the lower right, and then the Samaritan temple in the upper left. They could see this as Jesus talked with the Samaritan woman, probably pointing up. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain. She's probably pointing directly to the temple there. Deuteronomy 11 reminds us that for those who claim to be the people of God, then every day is an opportunity for decision. And it's true with us. John 15:10, "If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love." Those who abide in him are going to bear fruit, and they're going to demonstrate their covenant commitment. Moses then asked the Israelites to abide or remain in the love of the Lord. And of course, Jesus is the perfect Israelite. He did what the original generation could not. But then he also tasks us with the same choices. We have the choice of faith or fear, obedience versus disobedience. We have the choice for love or hate. But those who abide in him, again, bear fruit, and they demonstrate that commitment. And then this is where he says, "My Father is glorified in this, that you bear much fruit and prove to be my disciples." Our obedience from a position of faith and not obligation brings the Father and the Son great glory. Now, as we said, Moses is going to hit the pause button. In chapter 27, he's going to return to expand on these thoughts in chapter 11, including more details on the blessings and cursings to be read from Gerizim and Ebal. We'll see that at the end of the book. But this middle section from chapter 12 through 26, Moses is going to read the law. And we can either view this as a boring recap of Old Testament stuff that doesn't apply to us, or we can view it as an opportunity to hear and seek out God's will for our personal lives. He's plainly telling us in these next few chapters what he desires. I think if we give it serious study, we're not going to help but be blessed by it. So come back next time for Deuteronomy chapter 12, and we'll do this along the Talmudim way.